146 BCE, the walls of Carthage collapse after a siege that has lasted years. Smoke coils over broken temples. The city is silent not because the killing has ended, but because the survivors have been gathered. Tens of thousands are marched out alive. Among them are women, young, old, married, pregnant counted, not as people but as spoils. Before they are sold, before they are dispersed across the Mediterranean, they are herded into Roman victory camps. What happened to them there would never be written in triumphal inscriptions. The Roman camp is supposed to be order, lines of tents, standards planted in the earth, guards posted at intervals. It is also a place where law thins, where conquest has not yet hardened into bureaucracy. Victory camps sit in the dangerous hours between slaughter and civilization. In these spaces, Roman power is raw, and captive women exist entirely outside protection. The sources rarely linger. Roman historians preferred numbers to names, outcomes to suffering. Yet the fragments are there, scattered across legal texts, military manuals, and the cold assumptions of Roman property law. Captured women were classified immediately as res mancipi objects of ownership. They could be distributed, traded, reserved for sale, or assigned. Assignment came first. Commanders had discretion. A general could forbid abuse, but enforcement depended on discipline and temperament. Scipio Aemilianus reportedly attempted restraint after Carthage fell, not from mercy, but from control. Others were less concerned. The camp was a reward system. Soldiers expected compensation. If silver was scarce, batas became currency. Imagine standing inside one of these camps at dusk. Fires lit. Armor stacked, wine poured. Triumph not yet sanctified by the Senate, but already celebrated by the men who bled for it. What protection existed for women whose families lay dead beyond the perimeter? Roman law was explicit about ownership. A captive woman belonged to the man who claimed her unless reassigned by a superior. There was no concept of consent applicable to slaves. A woman's resistance had no legal meaning. Her survival depended on chance rank, mood, superstition. Some officers took captives into their personal tents, not temporarily, but as investments. A young woman unmarked by injury fetched a higher price later. The system was not accidental. Rome's expansion relied on mass enslavement. After the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, Macedon's defeat resulted in over 150,000 captives sold. Before markets opened, camps held them. Women were assessed, not for identity, but for durability. Could she walk? Could she work? Could she bear children? The camp was the first sorting ground. The psychological violence mattered as much as the physical. Women were stripped of names, separated from kin, and forced to adapt instantly to a new reality. Survival often meant silence. Memory became dangerous. Hope had to be rationed. Ancient writers never recorded their voices, but trauma leaves patterns. Later Roman texts complain of broken-spirited slaves, of women who resisted productivity, who refused food, who collapsed without illness. These behaviors did not begin in villas. They began in camps. Not all experiences were the same. Status before capture could alter fate. Elite women might be held separately, protected not for dignity but for ransom. Some were sent under guard to Rome to appear in triumphs, forced to walk in chains behind generals, their humiliation staged as political theater. Others disappeared into the ranks, their stories ending where the sources fall silent. Religion offered no shield. Roman soldiers believed conquest was sanctioned by the gods. Victory camps often included sacrifices, dedicatory rites, and vows fulfilled. In that worldview, the defeated existed beneath divine favor. To harm them was not sacrilege. It was confirmation, and yet tension existed even within Rome's own ideology. Excessive abuse could provoke unrest, disease, indiscipline. Commanders worried about morale and reputation. Limits were sometimes imposed not to protect women, but to protect order. Punishments, when recorded, targeted soldiers who disrupted hierarchy, not those who violated captives. The woman herself was never the injured party in Roman law. Every few minutes, carts left the camps. Some carried loot, others carried people. A woman taken at night might be gone by morning sold to a trader following the army. Sent to a farm, shipped to a brothel in Capua or Corinth, the camp was brief, but its imprint was permanent. Whatever happened there shaped the rest of her life. What would it mean to realize that survival required becoming invisible? As Rome expanded, these camps multiplied. Spain, Gaul, Greece, Judea, the pattern repeated with mechanical efficiency, capture, containment, distribution, silence. The empire's foundations were laid not only with roads and legions, but with unrecorded suffering that never entered official memory. If you dare to journey deeper into these forgotten shadows with brooding history, stay with us, because the camp was only the beginning. Soon, Rome would formalize what the camps initiated. Markets would open. Contracts would be signed. Lives would be priced. But before the ledger, before the household, before the chains settled into routine, there was this moment, unregulated, unprotected, and almost entirely erased. And as the night settled over those victory camps, with guards watching outward and no one watching inward, one question hung unanswered in the dark. How many futures were decided before dawn ever came? The answer, for most of them, would never be known. Because once the sun rose, the Roman machine moved forward, efficient, relentless, and indifferent to what it crushed beneath its wheels. By the late Republic, victory camps were no longer temporary anomalies of war. They were rehearsed systems. In Hispania during the campaigns of the 130s BCE, Roman legions began constructing standardized encampments even before battles were concluded, anticipating not only defense but containment. Prisoners were expected. Women were expected. Their suffering was assumed, budgeted into conquest like grain rations and marching distance. The Roman state rarely issued explicit orders regarding captive women. It didn't need to. Custom filled the silence. Military culture taught young soldiers that domination was proof of masculinity and conquest its purest expression. To take a woman from the defeated was not seen as a crime, but as a confirmation that Rome had won completely not just land, but lineage, memory, and future. Yet beneath that certainty, anxiety simmered. Camps were crowded, volatile spaces. Captives outnumbered guards. Disease spread quickly. Fear moved faster. Roman officers worried about revolt, poisoning, escape. Women were therefore kept deliberately fragmented, separated by age, origin, perceived usefulness. Bonds were broken before they could form. Trauma was not collateral, it was policy. In Gaul, during Caesar's campaigns of the 50s BCE, entire tribal populations were uprooted. Caesar himself records the sale of tens of thousands at once. What he does not describe is the holding period, the days or weeks when women remained inside Roman lines, waiting to be processed. Archaeology fills some of that void. Temporary enclosures, extra latrine pits, improvised fencing beyond the standard camp layout, signs of overcrowding, signs of human cargo. Some women attempted resistance not through violence, which was impossible, but through refusal. Refusal to eat, refusal to respond. Ancient authors mention captives who wasted away. The phrasing is revealing, as if life simply exited on its own, as if despair were a natural process, not an induced one. Roman overseers interpreted this as stubbornness or weakness, sometimes punishing it, sometimes letting it run its course. A dead slave was a loss, a broken one could still be sold. There were moments of contradiction. Roman ideology prized pudicitia female modesty, yet built its empire on sexual access to enslaved women. Writers like Livy expressed unease, but only when abuse disrupted Roman self-image. The violation of a foreign woman barely registered. The violation of a Roman woman, even a plebeian, could ignite political crisis. The boundary was not moral. It was civic. Consider Judea, 70 CE Jerusalem falls after months of siege. Josephus records mass enslavement, women and children led away in chains. Triumph follows. But before Rome sees them, the camps do. Roman soldiers, hardened by famine warfare, occupy a city hollowed by starvation. Captive women enter camps already stripped by hunger. Survival becomes calculation. Youth might mean protection, or it might mean repeated selection. Age offered no certainty either. Older women were worked until they collapsed, then discarded as unsellable. What does it do to a person to realize that every glance may be an assessment? Not all soldiers behaved identically. Some took captives as concubines, keeping them for months, even years, before sale or release. Roman law permitted manumission, but it was rare and gratitude was expected to replace trauma. A freed woman carried her past invisibly, marked by accent, by silence. By the children she might bear children who inherited her status at birth. This is where the camp's legacy deepens. Sexual access was not merely about pleasure or power, it was reproductive. Enslaved women produced enslaved children. Rome understood this. The camp was the first step in a generational system. Conquest did not end with defeat. It replicated itself in bodies. By the 1st century CE, traders followed armies deliberately. Contracts were prepared in advance. Prices fluctuated based on rumor youthful captives from the east fetched more. Hardened women from the west were valued for labor. The camp became a marketplace without stalls, where negotiation happened through officers, not victims. A woman might be promised to one man and claimed by another. There was no appeal. Ownership was fluid until finalized, and during that fluidity, abuse was easiest. If these stories feel buried, it is because Rome buried them well. Triumphs displayed chains and crowns, not knights and tents. Histories praised generals, not logistics. The silence around captive women is not absence of evidence, it is evidence of intent. Rome feared disorder above all. Excess threatened discipline. In rare cases, commanders intervened not out of mercy, but strategy. An army distracted by indulgence could be ambushed. An outbreak of violence could spark rebellion among captives. Control was recalibrated, never removed. If you find yourself drawn into these shadows, remember brooding history exists to explore what empires tried hardest to forget. Stay with us. As campaigns grew longer and borders stabilized, Rome refined enslavement into law. Camps fed markets. Markets fed households, households fed the illusion of peace. By the time a woman arrived at her final destination, a villa, a mine, a brothel, those chaotic violence was already behind her. What remained was routine. But routine does not erase memory. Trauma doesn't dissolve when paperwork is signed, it settles. And in the quiet corners of the empire, long after banners were folded and legions marched on, the camp still echoed inside the minds of those who survived it. As Rome congratulated itself on order and civilization, one question lingered unasked. How much of that order was built on terror that was never meant to be seen? That terror did not fade when the camps dissolved. It was carried forward, legalized, and absorbed into Rome's daily life. By the early empire, enslavement was no longer a chaotic consequence of war. It was infrastructure. Markets stood at crossroads in ports Delos, Ephesus, Capua designed to absorb human cargo at scale. Women moved through them stripped of context, their past compressed into a few attributes spoken aloud by brokers: age, origin, health, temperament. What had happened in the camps was not erased, it was converted into value. Sexual slavery was not a marginal practice hidden in alleyways. It was an accepted dimension of Roman ownership. Law did not distinguish between labor and sexual access. A female slave's body belonged entirely to her owner. Use was assumed, abuse was undefined. When jurists debated limits, the discussion centered on property damage, whether excessive harm reduced resale value, not on the woman herself. For many women captured in victory camps, the transition to markets did not end exploitation, it stabilized it. In camps, danger was unpredictable. In markets and households, it became routine. Predictability did not mean safety. It meant endurance. Sexual access could be demanded nightly or intermittently by one man or many, sanctioned by custom and silence. Resistance was reframed as disobedience. Pregnancy was reframed as productivity. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status automatically. This principal partis sequitur ventrum turned sexual domination into demographic strategy. Rome did not need constant conquest to sustain slavery. The system reproduced itself. A woman taken in Gaul could give birth in Latium to a child who would never know freedom, never know why their life began this way. The camp echoed across generations. Brothels formalized what households normalized. In cities, state-licensed brothels operated openly, staffed largely by enslaved women. Some had been bred into the role. Others arrived through conquest. Their names were replaced with stage names painted above doorways. Choice was irrelevant, profit was measured nightly. Roman satire mocked these spaces, never questioning their existence, only their clientele. The women inside remained abstractions. What happens to identity when survival requires constant fragmentation? Psychological damage surfaces only indirectly in the sources. Owners complain of slaves who flinch, who refuse eye contact, who sabotage tasks. Medical writers describe women plagued by fainting, insomnia, unexplained pain. They never connect these symptoms to trauma. The Roman world lacked a language for it. Instead, it applied discipline, punishment, or resale. Manumission is often cited as evidence of mercy. Some women were freed, many were not. Even freedom carried constraints, economic dependence, social stigma, ongoing sexual obligation. A freed woman who bore her former owner's children remained tied to him through patronage. Liberation rarely meant autonomy. It meant reclassification. As the empire aged, enslavement shifted from mass conquest to maintenance. Fewer new wars meant higher demand for reproductive slaves. Women's bodies became even more central to the system's survival. Sexual access was no longer merely opportunistic. It was essential. Violence softened into expectation. Silence deepened. At Brooding History, we unearth the darkest chapters the world tried to bury. Join us as we descend further, because the consequences did not end in antiquity. Long-term, the effects radiated outward. Entire regions were depopulated of women through repeated wars. Family structures collapsed, cultural memory fractured. Rome absorbed labor, but it also absorbed pain it refused to acknowledge. The empire's famed stability rested on a vast, unspoken underclass trained from captivity to compliance. Yet instability lingered beneath the surface. Slave revolts, rare, violent, and brutally suppressed, often followed patterns of sexual exploitation. Ancient writers note women among the rebels, though rarely by name. Their presence unsettled Roman readers. A woman who resisted contradicted the mythology of contented servitude. The system depended on the belief that domination worked. By the 3rd century CE, economic strain and political chaos exposed cracks. Laws attempted regulation restrictions on excessive cruelty, protections for pregnant slaves not out of empathy but fear of collapse. Rome was trying to manage the consequences of a system it could no longer fully control. Still, the camps remained the origin point. Every market transaction traced back to a moment of capture. Every household ritual carried the residue of violence. Rome's greatness was inseparable from what it erased. And so the question shifts. Not what happened in those victory camps, but what it cost the world when an empire normalized their logic. As the Western Empire faltered and the old structures decayed, the women who had passed through camps, markets, and households left little trace in the record. No monuments, no epitaphs, only systems built upon their disappearance. When Rome finally fell, its laws collapsed, its armies scattered, its cities shrank. But the patterns it perfected of conquest, commodification, and sanctioned silence did not die with it. And as the shadows lengthened over a changing world, one final question waited, unresolved and uncomfortable. If an empire can thrive while erasing so many lives, what does that say about the foundations we still stand on? That question lingers because the damage did not end with Rome's collapse. It traveled forward, embedded in memory, law, and inherited silence. For the women who survived Roman captivity, there was no moment of release from what had been done to them. Trauma did not belong to the past. It reshaped the present. Ancient texts hint at this obliquely, slaves described as difficult, unstable, ungrateful. These were not character flaws. They were symptoms. The Roman world simply refused to recognize them as such. Psychological aftermath was invisible by design. A woman who had endured conquest, violation, and forced displacement was expected to function seamlessly in a household economy. She cooked, she cleaned, she bore children. She smiled when commanded. Her silence was interpreted as obedience. Her breakdowns were treated as inconvenience. Rome measured stability by productivity, not by human cost. Children raised by enslaved women inherited more than legal status. They inherited fear. Behavioral patterns passed quietly from mother to child: hypervigilance, emotional withdrawal, sudden compliance. Roman authors never traced these traits to origin. They blamed nature, yet the system itself produced them. The camp did not only break individuals, it shaped populations. As Christianity spread across the empire, moral language shifted, but structures remained. Church fathers condemned excess, yet accepted slavery as a social reality. Sexual access to enslaved women was criticized in theory and tolerated in practice. Conversion did not free captives, it sanctified endurance. The vocabulary changed, the silence stayed. What does it mean when suffering becomes so normalized that it no longer needs justification? Rome's legacy is often framed through architecture, law, governance. Rarely through the interior lives it dismantled. Victory camps never left ruins meant to endure. They were temporary by design, spaces of transition where responsibility dissolved. That impermanence made them powerful. What happens there leaves no monument, no inscription, no accountable memory, yet echoes remain. Later empires adopted similar logics: conquest first, categorization second, exploitation third. The Roman template proved efficient. Dehumanization worked best when it was procedural, when no single hand could be blamed. Camps became holding zones in other centuries, under other banners, different languages. Same silence. In Rome, the end came slowly. No dramatic reckoning for the enslaved. No collective acknowledgement. Systems simply eroded under pressure. But erosion is not absolution. The absence of justice does not erase harm, it transfers it forward. The women taken into Roman victory camps were never meant to be remembered. Their anonymity was essential to the empire's self-image. To name them would have required Rome to confront what it was. So it didn't. And yet history does not forget as cleanly as empires hope. Pain that is unrecorded still shapes outcomes. Trauma that is unnamed still alters behavior. Silence does not mean absence. If these shadows feel uncomfortably close, that is because they are. Power still relies on invisibility. Systems still depend on who is allowed to speak and who is expected to endure without record. The story ends where it began, in a camp, at the edge of order, where human lives were reduced to utility and then dispersed. No closure, no restoration, only continuation. The shadows of history are long, and they do not recede on their own. Subscribe to Brooding History and walk with us through the blood-stained pages of the past, because what was buried still matters, and what was silenced still speaks.